She was arrested after causing an absurd scandal in a cafe because the attendant looked at her funny. When she arrived at the police station, she started shouting that this was an injustice and that she was not a criminal. While the police officers were trying to calm her down, she saw the gun in one of their holsters and, in an act of pure desperation, tried to pull it out. What happened next was a spectacle worthy of a reality show and a big mistake on her part. Every town has that person, the one that the market workers recognize from afar and pretend to be busy to avoid talking to. The one who has already been banned from at least 3 stores for shouting at sales clerks. The one who thinks everything is a big conspiracy against her. And of course, the one who knows the police on a first-name basis. This woman was a walking problem. And, like any problem that refuses to stay small, there came a day when she crossed the line. It all started in a ridiculous and predictable way. She walked into a cafe in the center, the kind of quiet place where people just want to drink their coffee in peace and go about their day without having to interact with problematic people. But peace was something that didn't exist in her vocabulary. The barista only asked, "What can I get you today?" And that was enough for her to turn into an erupting volcano. Her posture changed, her breathing became short, and her eyes flashed with the kind of exaggerated indignation of someone who is always looking for a reason to fight. The barista's tone of voice had deeply offended her existence. Suddenly, she was pointing her finger in the attendant's face, talking about respect, about how young people nowadays no longer know how to treat customers, and about how this cafe would never get her money again. Only, in the middle of the performance, she knocked over her own coffee. And that's when everything fell apart. All she got was the manager showing up to ask her to leave the premises. Refusing to leave was her specialty. Now the shouting included words like violation of rights, dictatorship of commerce, and discrimination against white middle-class customers. When she started pushing chairs and banging on the benches, someone finally called the police. 2 police officers arrived in less than 5 minutes, probably already used to this kind of situation. They didn't even have to ask what was going on. All they had to do was look at the coffee-smeared woman with her arms crossed and a look on her face like she thought she was about to sue half the world. The older policeman tried to talk. His mistake. She started talking about abuse of authority, how she had influential contacts, and how the policeman should be more careful who he was dealing with. Faced with so much resistance to something so stupid, the policeman said, without patience, "Ma'am, if you keep disturbing the place, we'll have to take you to the police station." Her expression changed. It was a brief moment, but noticeable, as if she had understood, for the first time in her life, that maybe, just maybe, she was about to suffer a real consequence. And, like every coward who thinks he's powerful until he realizes that the tables have turned, she reacted in the worst possible way. She pushed the policeman. At the same time, he and his partner exchanged glances like, "Okay, enough of this bullshit," and handcuffed her right there. The woman struggled, saying that this was a kidnapping, that she was being beaten, and that they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. Now, she was on her way to the police station. And if she thought the confusion was over, she had no idea what was still to come. Because the real chaos was about to begin as soon as she entered that building. The drive to the police station was a real horror show. In the back of the car, she didn't shut up for a second. The officers were already visibly exhausted, but they kept their composure. It wasn't the first time they'd taken someone away like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She began by saying that this was a kidnapping, that she was being forcibly removed from an establishment without justification, that she had constitutional rights, and that all this would be resolved with a phone call. Within minutes, she was accusing the officers of police violence, abuse of authority, and even racism, even though she was as white as printer paper. When the car pulled up in front of the police station, she looked disgusted. as if the building was unworthy of her presence. As soon as the doors opened, she refused to leave. She sat down on the bench and crossed her arms, saying she wouldn't leave until she had spoken to a lawyer. The policemen exchanged glances, sighed, and one of them simply said, "It's your choice. You can leave on your own, or we'll take you out." It was at this point that she decided to dramatize even more. She threw her body backwards and started pretending to collapse. "I'm feeling sick. My chest is tight. I need a doctor. I could be having a heart attack." No policeman bought the theater, but of course, by protocol, they called a paramedic from the police station to check it out. The man arrived, took the stethoscope, asked a few basic questions, and, in less than 2 minutes, decreed, "She's fine." Absolute silence. She opened her eyes as if she couldn't believe she hadn't fooled anyone. Then, with no more arguments, she decided to change tactics. She got up and walked into the police station as if she were the most powerful person in the world. Now inside the building, the new outbursts began. First, he complained about the temperature, saying that the waiting room was too hot. Then she started saying that the bench she had been told to sit on was uncomfortable, and that it was a disrespect to human dignity. When one of the officers handed her a clipboard to fill in her details, she refused, saying she wouldn't go along with this farce. "Do you know who I am? This will cost you dearly." The policeman had no patience for this kind of show. He just crossed his arms and waited. After a few seconds of uncomfortable silence, she realized that no one was going to beg her to fill anything in, so she picked up the clipboard and scribbled something down, huffing like a tantruming child. But the real moment of chaos was yet to come. She looked around as if she were studying her surroundings, probably thinking about how to cause more trouble. By now, the police station was full, with officers circulating back and forth, some people giving evidence, others waiting to be attended to. That's when she saw something that caught her eye. A policeman standing near the counter, with his gun still in its holster. No one can say exactly what went through her head at that moment. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was just that pathetic feeling of wanting to be in control of the situation. But the fact is that in a quick, impulsive movement, she tried to pull the policeman's gun. It was a split second. She stepped forward, grabbed the handle of the gun, and tried to pull it out. But the policeman reacted even faster. He pushed her back and held the holster firmly, preventing the gun from coming out. And, in a matter of seconds, the entire police station stopped. All the officers in the room turned in the direction of the commotion. Those who were talking interrupted their conversations. She stood there, wide-eyed, realizing the size of the mess she had just made. The policeman grabbed her by the arm and pinned her to the ground in a matter of seconds. It was automatic, instinctive. "You can't do this to me! It was a misunderstanding!" And the only thing left for her to do was come up with a convincing enough excuse to try and get out of it. If she was already in trouble for contempt before, now she was guaranteed a premium ticket to judicial hell. Tampering with a policeman's gun inside a police station wasn't just a mistake. It was the kind of thing that turned a silly scandal into something much, much worse. As soon as they tried to handcuff her again, the outburst began in earnest. She struggled, screamed, and twisted her body, trying to break free at any cost. Only, unlike the scene in the cafe, where people were uncomfortable and avoided eye contact, now she was dealing with trained police officers who had seen this kind of scene before. She continued to resist, but the officers were not impressed in the slightest. First came denial. She shouted that she hadn't done anything, that it was all a mistake, that the policeman had moved and bumped into her. Then came the dramatization phase. She started crying, screaming that she was a defenseless woman being abused by the police, that they couldn't treat her like that. When they realized that her show wasn't going to end anytime soon, they threw her to the ground and immobilized her for good. The whole police station stopped to watch. Other police officers approached to see what was happening. Those who were there waiting for assistance started recording, because it was obvious that this scene was going to end up on the internet sooner or later. She continued to lie on the ground, kicking and screaming nonsense, until one of the police officers finally said, out of patience, "It's over." The tone of voice was so dry that, for a second, she stopped. She looked around, probably trying to calculate what she could do to get out of this. But there was no way out. She had passed the point of return and was now standing there, with her arms bound, surrounded by police officers who were no longer willing to negotiate. They still tried to lift her calmly, but she made it difficult. She threw her body backwards, pushed against the handcuffs, and, when they realized she wasn't going to cooperate, they just dragged her to the temporary holding cell. As soon as they heard the sound of the bars closing, it was as if the noise in the police station had died down. Now that she was locked up, she could no longer try to run, fight, or shout at anyone. For the first few minutes, she couldn't accept reality. She banged on the fence, demanded a lawyer, shouted that she wanted to file a complaint against the police officers who had attacked her, and said that this would have consequences for everyone. The policemen just carried on, as if nothing had happened. No response, no reaction. They knew that the best medicine for people like her was to ignore it until the outbreak passed. And eventually, it did. Her energy began to run out. The screams turned into complaints. Complaints turned into grumbles. Finally, she became quiet. Now, alone on the metal bench inside the cell, she began to really understand what she had done. She looked around nervously, probably reliving every moment in her head. It was no longer just a question of being arrested for a disturbance. She had tried to pull a policeman's gun. Even if she hadn't succeeded, that was a serious charge. She could be charged with attempting to disarm authority, maybe resisting arrest, maybe something worse. She didn't know. Time inside that cell seemed to pass more slowly. She looked at the police officers, hoping that someone would come along and offer an easy way out. Perhaps a conversation, perhaps a way of resolving the matter without further problems. But no one was interested in helping her. 2 hours passed, and, for the first time, real desperation struck. Now she had no audience for her performance. She had no one to shout at, no way of attracting attention. She was no longer in control of the situation. She tried to speak to the nearest policeman, but was completely ignored. The silence was worse than anything else. For the first time in her life, she was really facing a consequence for her actions, and now she had nowhere else to run. Time inside that cell seemed to move more slowly than usual. She had already shouted, screamed, banged on the railing, demanded a lawyer, and tried to reason with any policeman who passed by. But nobody cared. Nobody gave a damn. And that, for someone like her, was worse than any physical punishment. After all, she had always believed that her voice was the most important in the room. She always knew that if she shouted loud enough, someone would listen to her demands. That, in the end, everything would work out her way. But this wasn't a shopping mall. It wasn't a restaurant. It wasn't just any store where she could ask for the manager and make a fuss until she got what she wanted. There, she was nobody. And worse, she had passed the point where a simple apology would have solved things. Time dragged on. The metal bench she was sitting on was uncomfortable. The light in the police station was cold and lifeless, and the smell of the place was beginning to bother her. Everything seemed to contribute to her feeling of discomfort and helplessness. She tried to look around, trying to decipher any clue as to what would happen to her. In the distance, she saw the police officers carrying on with their routines, attending to other people, filling out paperwork, dealing with real problems. She wasn't a priority, and that was killing her inside. At some point, she began to think that it might be better to change tactics. If shouting and demanding a lawyer wasn't working, maybe it was time to pretend to be sorry. Maybe cry quietly, make a poor face, say she didn't know what she was doing, that she was nervous, that she wasn't a criminal. But would anyone there fall for it? The truth was that now she needed a plan. She needed to understand what was going on, what they were saying about her, what her real situation was. The problem was that for the first time in her life, she had no information. She had always been the type to know everything about everyone. She knew the names of the managers of the places where she shopped. She knew which employees were new and which could be manipulated. She knew how to turn any complaint into a matter of principle. She knew how to bend people in her favor. But now, nothing. Nothing but a piercing silence and the weight of his own idiocy. Then something broke the monotony. Across the room, one of the policemen picked up a phone and started talking to someone. The tone was formal, but the subject was clear. He was talking about her. She tried to listen, leaned forward a little, straining her ears, but the conversation was too low. What were they discussing? About the bail? About the charge? About the possible sentence? His heart began to beat faster. For the first time, she was really afraid. Because it was one thing to be arrested for public nuisance, something that a good lawyer could resolve without major consequences. But trying to take a policeman's gun inside a police station? That was another story. If they started treating her like a real threat, she could face something much more serious than a simple warning. After all, how many videos had she seen on the internet of people who did less than that and ended up with heavy criminal charges? What if no one could get her out of it? What if, for the first time in her life, she had gone beyond the point of no return? She looked at the police officers, trying to decipher something, but none of them seemed concerned or in a hurry to solve her case. And that was the worst thing of all. It wasn't a priority. And when she was finally called in to talk to someone, she didn't know what was ahead. For the first time, she felt the real weight of what she had done. And that hurt more than any handcuff. Time seemed to have stopped. The heavy air of the police station made everything more suffocating. The cold white lights made the room seem even more oppressive, and the piercing silence only made the discomfort worse. But nothing was worse than the wait. She didn't know what they were going to do to her. She'd tried all the tactics she'd used all her life. Shouting, threatening, screaming, demanding rights, playing the victim. Nothing worked. No one there seemed interested in her theater. And now all she had to do was wait. The hard bench in the cell was already bothering her back. Her legs were numb after sitting for so long, and the tension built up in her body was starting to turn into a slight tremor. But the worst thing was the uncertainty. She looked around, staring at the policemen, trying to pick up any detail that might indicate what would happen next. They still didn't give a damn. They were still filling in forms, talking on the phone, attending to other people. It was as if she wasn't even there, and for someone like her, that was unbearable. All her life she had been driven by a sense of importance that no one around her could confirm. She always got what she wanted by shouting. She was always sure that, in the end, she would come out on top. But now, not even the police cared. And it was only after an eternity that one of them finally approached. The sound of the key turning in the lock broke the silence, and she startled slightly. The policeman opened the grill and just nodded. "Let's go." No explanation. Not a word more. She hesitated for a second before getting up. Her legs were stiff, as if her body was resisting what would come next. But she had no choice. The policeman started walking, and she followed, still not knowing what would happen. Each step made her heart race faster. She was led into a simple, cold, windowless room. In the middle was a metal table with a few chairs and a computer in the corner. The atmosphere was impersonal, with nothing that gave any sense of comfort or familiarity. She sat down automatically, not because she wanted to, but because she knew there was no alternative. The silence was cut by the sound of the door closing behind her. The policeman who entered with her seemed far too calm for someone who was about to end his life. Without haste, he organized some papers on the table before looking up. "Do you know how much trouble you're in?" She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. The policeman didn't seem interested in the answer anyway. She already knew she'd hear excuses. He flipped through some papers, checked his notes, and continued. Public disturbance, contempt, resisting arrest, and now attempting to disarm an officer. The word disarming made her stomach sink. She wanted to say that she hadn't tried anything, that it was a misunderstanding, that she would never pick up a real gun. But would anyone believe her? After all the theater, all the resistance, all the confusion, she always thought she knew how far she could go. She knew she was unbearable, but she had never crossed such a dangerous line. Now, the feeling of control was simply no longer there. The policeman continued with his explanation, no emotion in his voice. Your lawyer can try to get the charges reduced, but with the evidence we have, it won't be easy. There it was, confirmation that this wasn't going to magically disappear. She'd spent her life getting into trouble and had always come out unscathed. She'd make a fuss, threaten to sue, pretend to be a victim, and in the end, someone always sorted it out for her. But now it was different. Now they had proof. Images from the police station's cameras clearly showed the moment she tried to pull the policeman's gun. The police officer went on to explain that a judge would set bail, that the charges could be revised depending on the defense, but that, in any case, this would not be something she would forget the next day. And at that moment, it finally hit her. She was no longer the angry customer at the supermarket. She was no longer the neighbor who called the police because the children were playing too loudly. Now she was just a criminal, and for the first time, there was no escape. Do you know anyone who thinks they can get away with anything until reality hits? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and like it. Want to see more stories like this? Click on the card and come marathon. See you in the next video.